says, pray in this way. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive yours.
So big. You are so big. So let us praise God. Oh Lord. Oh, you are so big. Absolutely huge. So absolutely huge. Gosh, we're all really impressed down here, I can tell you. Gosh, we're all really impressed down here, I can tell you. Forgive us, O Lord, for this our dreadful toadying. And it's flattering. But you're so strong and, well, just so super. Fantastic. Amen. Oh Lord, please don't burn us.
Well, you did better than 9 o'clock. They didn't even laugh after that. I think they thought it was serious. Oh, wait. Okay, we're there now, Rob? Thanks. Oftentimes we think of God as being this big untouchable thing, this thing that's kind of intimidating or out of reach and maybe not together with us or not close to us in very many ways. So when we talk about things like prayer and spiritual practice, it's very hard to kind of wrap our minds around that because we can't even imagine having a personal conversation with God. And that's really what prayer is all about. So this whole series is about those spiritual practices that we can do in our everyday, ordinary life that are down-to-earth things, things that connect us to God through our everyday lives, not just something that treats God as somewhere out there, far away, something so big and so super that we can't even have a conversation. So when we first started the series a couple weeks ago, we started with what we call guidance prayers. And guidance prayers are those prayers that you do first thing in the morning, where you start rehearsing your schedule for the day, and you invite God into that rehearsal, so that you invite God into your plans for the day and ask God's guidance for that day, and for an awareness of God's presence throughout the day, so that we can use God in our decision making and listen to God's voice as we take steps out into life. Guidance prayers can be really simple and easy to do. It's just an open conversation with God, just rehearsing your day and recognizing that God is present with you. And then last week we had 3 groups from our youth come and talk to us about their experience out and about on the different mission trips and Faith Singers tours and the hiking that they did in Colorado. And what we heard so much of from them was how amazing it was to step into somebody else's story and experience that story with them, even though they didn't even know who that person was. That's an experience of God through someone you don't even know. For most of us, it's really easy to kind of reach out and help a family member, a brother, a sister, a neighbor, a friend. We're expected to do that. That's what friends do. That's what families do, right? But these students actually intentionally put themselves out there for service to, with, and for people they don't even know. That's an intentional spiritual practice. That's a way of stepping into somebody else's story and recognize that God's there too. and then you experience God in a way that you wouldn't have in any other way. So all the support that Countryside does to create opportunities for these students to do this year after year, every summer in these mission trips, should be applauded. And I applaud all of you and all the adult chaperones and everybody that went and made that possible, because it's a great experience. These students are stepping out in huge courage, trusting that God's presence is with them to greet these people that they have no idea who they are or what their situation is, and yet are courageous enough to enter those stories. And this week, we're going to talk a little bit more about prayer, but we're going to talk about prayers from the heart. And these types of prayers are prayers that are not scripted. They have no particular form. There's no order for them. There's no particular conversation or language that you need to use. There's no rules for what you can talk about and what you can't talk about. And it's something that comes from your heart. It comes from that place in your heart where you're yearning to connect with God, with things that are heavy on your heart. So we'll be talking about how those work and how we can apply them in everyday applications. We face things every day that aren't always so friendly, and we don't know how to traverse those kinds of paths. And having a conversation with God just from your heart is one way into working through those kinds of situations. So today in our scripture, we had the Lord's Prayer from the Gospel of Matthew. And when we talk about the Lord's Prayer, I think most of you, or some of you at least, remember learning the Lord's Prayer as a child, right? How many of you learned the Lord's Prayer as a child, right? Oftentimes that's the case, but then you don't really start thinking about it or learning about it until you're an adult and you start thinking about what you're actually saying, right? And trying to figure out what it is you're doing. Now, this is a scripted kind of a prayer, but it's an important kind of a prayer because, as we saw from our Monty Python clip, oftentimes we feel really distanced from God, and we have no idea how to begin that conversation with God. And so the Lord's Prayer was the disciples asking Jesus, how do we have a conversation with this almighty, everlasting being? Is there some kind of protocol for how we have this conversation? And Jesus says, well, let me give you some ideas of how you step into that. There are waypoints along the way that guide you into a conversation with God. And it says, if you really want to pray to God, here's one way into it. And so as a child, we learn this prayer because we don't know often how to start that conversation with God. And the Lord's Prayer is the perfect place to begin. First of all, one of the waypoints that it guides us into this conversation is that the very first line of it tells us who we're talking to, who we're speaking to. We're not talking to, oh, Lord, you are so huge. We're talking to our Father, right? We have a relationship already with this everlasting almighty being. And that relationship wasn't started by us. It was started by God. God created us. God established that relationship. And God acts like a parent to us, someone who created us, loves us, and continually forgives us and sustains us. We have standing already with this being, right? We have a relationship that allows us to open conversation with one another. It's not some kind of distant, faraway person that we can't talk to. It's an actual relationship that we're already in. And the second point is then, once you establish who it is you're talking to, and you know that it's a parent that will love you no matter whether you've done something to be proud of or not, because that's how parents work, then what you get to say is, what is it that you are seeking in this conversation? And for the Lord's Prayer, Jesus suggests that what we're seeking actually is God's will, God's kingdom that is promised to all of us as children of God. It's that yearning and that seeking that brings us to church every Sunday morning. And that connection with God. If that's what we're seeking, that's what we're praying for, and that's what we're asking of God. We're also having a relationship and talking about the God who sustains us on an everyday basis, provides for us our daily bread, forgives us daily so that we're able to forgive other people and move through life together as a community. This is the community that we're sharing, and this is the conversation that we're having. God, I'm counting on you to help show me the way. You're the one that provides for me. You're the one that forgives me so that I can forgive others. This is our relationship. We love and are loved by one another, and that opens that conversation even further. And the last one is save us from the time of trial. We remember in this particular waypoint that God is with us always and is present with us always, which means that we have nothing to fear when we enter those dark spaces, those places where it's really uncomfortable, those places where we have no idea what we're doing, because God's presence with us is that courage and that trust that we take with us into those situations. And we realize that in that, God is actually saving us from the time of trial, not the one putting us to trial. In fact, God is acting as the advocate against the evil one in this prayer in order to keep us safe from those trials and temptations that the evil one constantly tries us with concerning our love and our compassion on a daily basis. So we have this ongoing relationship and already have this kind of standard prayer by which we have been having this conversation with God all along. And as we walk through each one of these waypoints, we're like navigating a river. And we're stepping further and further and further into it. And with each step, we're gaining more confidence and more courage in order to talk about those things that are so close to us. We often start with those things that we've memorized in our head and that we have this standard practice that we use to enter a conversation. But as we step further and further out and gain more and more courage, we can relax a bit into the relationship, maybe float a bit. And in that, we can step out and start speaking about those things with this God that are close to our heart, things that we care most deeply about, things that we are most afraid of, things that we worry the most about. Prayers from the heart are things that come from the center of who we are, to talk to the very core of our being, our Creator. And so those things are unscripted. They have no particular form, and they have to come from the heart, because that's where their meaning lies. And these kinds of prayers are prayers that move us beyond what we think we ought to be and step into the love of God that allows us to be who we have been promised to become. Prayers of the heart take that much deeper step into living so that we can participate with what God is already doing in the world. We have asked God to guide us and to lead us, and as we take these steps with these prayers from the heart, then we are also then telling God that we'd like to participate in what God is already doing in the world. So as we listen to a little bit of music, I would like to have you all think about that yearning that is inside of you to connect with God, and where that yearning is drawing you. Where are the things of your heart that you can talk to God about in maybe not so formal a way, but an informal, heartfelt, wholehearted conversation with God.
Rustling of the leaves used to be my lullaby. Days so long ago when I was a tot so high, and to sleep, lullaby of the leaves. I'm breezing along in the breeze. I'm hearing a song in the trees. Oh, that kind melody caressing the shores, familiar to me, I've heard it before. Oh, that's heaven, don't I feel it in my soul, and don't I know I've reached my goal. Oh, sing me to sleep, lullaby of the leaves. I'm swinging along in the breeze. I'm hearing a song in the trees. Oh, that kind melody caressing the shores, familiar to me, I've heard it before. Oh, that's heaven, don't I feel it in my soul, and don't I know I've reached my goal. Oh, sing me to sleep, lullaby of the leaves.
Then he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial."
Whatever waypoints we use to help us have a conversation with God are important steps into a deeper relationship with God and with one another. Conversation always creates the opportunity for a deeper relationship with one another. And just like when my kids learned how to do the Lord's Prayer as their way into a conversation with God, to where they could start learning saying things like "God bless Grandma" and "God bless Grandpa" and my aunts and my uncles and my friend down the street who just got a new dog. They used the Lord's Prayer as the start of their conversation with God, and then went into the "God bless Mom and Dad" and all those other kinds of people. And those were those prayers that were in their heart. So however you take your journey into that deeper conversation where you start talking about those things that weigh heavy on your heart, then that means that you're stepping into a deeper place in the current where God's love is the flow that carries you along. And this whole application of such prayers is designed to help you journey and navigate those places where you don't know what to do. Jesus was facing crucifixion in our last scripture and had no clue what to do next. There are dark times in our lives. There are dark times in our communities. And prayers from the heart are often the way through those into conversations with one another and with our communities so that we can act out in God's love. And so I'm asking for you to help me walk through a very practical application of what these prayers of the heart look like. And I'd like to use the situation that happened in O'Neill last Wednesday as the situation to talk about this. These are hard times for us, and it's always hard to start a conversation about something that seemingly is so charged with political anger and frustration that we can't even talk to one another. So how do we use these waypoints of Jesus to step us into these conversations with one another? How many of you heard about what happened in O'Neill last Wednesday? Okay, a lot of you know. But for those of you who don't know, there was an ICE raid. The Immigration Customs Office had a raid of O'Neill, 2 or 3 of their businesses there. They were trying to get to a group of people who are human trafficking workers, undocumented workers, and using them like as slavery. And in trying to get to them, they rounded up what they thought were undocumented workers and detained them to get at the other people as well. But in the process, what happened was the parents were detained and put on buses and taken to Grand Island, where they were held in a tent in a parking lot in Grand Island for a number of hours. And the kids were left at home with no parents. Not such a great plan, really. But it took a community to come around that and figure out what to do. But there was all kinds of outrage about what happened on both sides, and bringing the two folks' kinds of sides together to talk about, well, we're doing a good thing here, we're stopping human trafficking, we're not allowing slavery, it's all good stuff. But kids got caught up in the midst of that too. So how do we have that conversation? And the churches were the ones that stood up and said, we are a community here. Whether these people are documented or undocumented people, they are people of our community, and we are responsible for them. Our gospel calls us to be those who protect the widow and the orphan. Regardless of the political situation that's there, we need to care for one another, and that starts with a conversation. And prayer is the opening to that conversation. They have gathered people together to help with the children's care. A lot of the parents have been reunited with their children now, but they're still under investigation, so no one knows what's going to happen yet. The whole immigration reform thing is up for grabs, and everybody's got an opinion on that. So how do we come together as a community to have those kind of hard, harrowing and heartbreaking conversations with one another, and be able to not solve or create one problem by solving another problem? And how do we involve listening for God's voice in the midst of those conversations? That's key to this. When we speak about our prayers from the heart, what we're asking for is the seeking of God's kingdom, right? God's will in this situation. How do we love and nurture one another? How will we deal with our anger over this situation? How will we step into some kind of solution for these kinds of situations? These are happening in our times. We have to address them. And we have to come together in God's love to address them as people of God, regardless of the political situation. That's what we are called to be about when we are called to enter that flow of God's love. So how do we go about doing that? What are we looking for? How do these prayers help us talk about what's on our heart and what we care most about, as well as what we fear most, in order to start a conversation with one another and behave as children of God with one another. When we do this, we reach out from the core of who we are, and we become the community of God that witnesses to God's love in the rest of the community. Let's care for one another. Let's support one another. Let's feed the hungry. These prayers are prayers that are going to be sounding more like Jesus' prayer from the cross rather than the prayer that he gave his disciples. On the night in which he was betrayed, he was crying out the injustice of the whole thing to God. He was asking at Gethsemane, may this cup be taken from me if it can be. Those are prayers from the heart. They're not scripted. Those are prayers that come through a cloud of pain and empathy. And all of us have those. We're threatened almost every day with a darkness that could overcome us. So what Jesus does on the cross is cry out to God from his heart in order to address the one who saves us from the darkness, who reaches out and sits with us in the darkness so that it's not able to overcome us. That's who our Creator is, and that's who we're speaking to when we speak from the heart. When we enter God's flow, we as a community come together and we act out that love. Out of those free conversations that we have from our heart, it inspires us then into action of God's love. Action like feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, right? Nurturing those children who are left behind. Nurturing one another in a very conflicted world. How do we go about doing that if we can't be a community together? And being a community together means speaking our hearts to one another without judgment, but in God's love. That's how we enter God's flow. How can we help? In situations like this, there's always something to do. There's an immigration roundtable that's happening. And the churches in O'Neill are holding 6-7 families in their buildings as a sanctuary, and so they're going to need food, they're going to need clothing, they're going to need house stuff. You can reach out like that. There's all kinds of things that you can act out your love with, but you have to be in conversation with one another to do that. Micah 6 shows us what it's like to enter God's flow. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Oh God, you are so huge. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, even second and thirdborns? Shall I offer the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? We don't know what to do in times of chaos. We don't know what we need to do to set things right. But that's exactly what Micah is asking of God, and it's coming from the yearning and the desire of his heart. God has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of us? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. That's what it is to step out of the prayers of the heart into an act of love. Stepping into the current of God's flow, of nurturing and supporting one another. That's what heart does. Wholeheartedness gives us the courage, the calm, and the trust in God's presence to step out, freely expressing what's in our heart and acting in God's love through a community of people who are called to protect God's creation. We have a tri-faith picnic this afternoon where we will gather with our Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters And we are, in fact, in conversation. We've been doing this for over 5 years now. Every minute of the day, we're stepping further and further into those conversations and getting to know these people really well. They're getting a chance to know us really well. And we're acting together in God's love, even though we all didn't think we had all that much in common. And yet here we are in like our 6th annual Tri-Faith Picnic. Our ministry through the Tri-Faith is our greatest source of resistance against hate as we step into God's love. We are having a conversation with folks who are equally threatened by immigration laws. What would we do if ICE raided our Tri-Faith Picnic? How would we reach out to our community to speak to these people about these other people in our lives who we've grown to love? They're God's children, and they're our community. We are acting in God's love. We are doing justice. We are walking humbly with God every time we have a conversation with someone at the Tri-Faith. This is our love of God being acted out of the prayers of our hearts. And so I encourage all of you to come join us this afternoon. Be in that conversation with us and join that resistance against hate. Not against any particular political party, but against the hate that separates us all from one another and instead allows us to step into the flow of God's love. The spiritual practice invitation that I invite you all to this week is to set a few reminders on your phone or your calendar and take 5 minutes a couple times a day in order to breathe deeply and to notice that God is actually with you, present with you, and start that prayer conversation. You can speak directly from your heart, from your desires and your yearnings that brought you here this morning, for instance. Or you can start with something like the Lord's Prayer that will step you into that conversation with God. But as you pray, I'm asking that you notice that that yearning is inside you to connect. And that yearning is not just a connection with God, but with the whole community in which we live. Notice that yearning and let that yearning itself be the thing that guides you into God's love and does not stop you from talking to one another, because that's where the love is shared. May it be so. Amen.